Somewhere in a Pentagon database, 15 wounded American soldiers just vanished overnight. Not because they got better, not because of some clerical fix anyone bothered to explain. They were simply removed from the official count, quietly, with zero public comment, while the ceasefire in the Iran war was still supposedly holding steady. No press release, no apology, no acknowledgement that it even happened at all. And when reporters actually tracked down the people responsible for explaining it, the answer they got back was almost too absurd to believe. Nobody available to comment. Try again later. That's the story we're about to break down piece by piece. And by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly why so many military families are furious right now, and honestly, why you probably should be too. Let's set the stage first, because you need the full timeline to understand just how strange the specific incident really is. The war between the United States and Iran started on February 28th, when America and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iranian targets. From day one, the Pentagon has published official casualty numbers through a system called the Defense Casualty Analysis System, or DCAS for short, a database that's technically been tracking American combat casualties all the way back to World War I. It's supposed to be the authoritative, trustworthy source for exactly one thing. How many American service members have been killed or wounded in this war? Straightforward, right? Except almost from the very beginning, that number has behaved in ways that don't make a whole lot of sense. On April 8th, the day a ceasefire deal was actually struck between the Trump administration and Iran, the official tally of American dead and wounded stood at 385. You'd think, logically, that once a ceasefire actually takes effect, that number should stop climbing, or at least climb very slowly, since active combat had technically paused. Instead, over the following days, that number kept rising anyway, eventually reaching 428. Then, on April 21st, something happened that nobody at the Pentagon has ever fully explained. The number of wounded in action troops dropped by exactly 15, without a single word of public comment from the War Department, bringing the overall total down to 413. Read that sequence again, because it matters. The number goes up during a ceasefire, which is confusing enough on its own. And then it goes down. Not because anyone recovered or because a clerical error got fixed with an explanation attached, but because 15 wounded troops simply disappeared from an official government casualty list with zero public accounting for where they went or why they were removed in the first place. When journalists actually tried to get an answer, the response they got was almost comically evasive. 2 separate Pentagon spokespeople said they were unable to answer any questions about the missing 15 casualties, both claiming that only a specific duty officer could address it, and that this duty officer simply wasn't at their desk. One of them actually said, word for word, that as soon as the duty officer returned to their desk, they would pass the question along. A full day passed. Multiple follow-up requests were sent. And still, no explanation ever came. Whatever actually happened to those 15 wounded service members, the Pentagon has never told the American public, not even after being asked directly, repeatedly by name. Now, if this were an isolated incident, one weird clerical mistake in an otherwise transparent system, that would be one thing. But this fits into a much larger, much more troubling pattern that had already been building for weeks before this specific disappearance ever happened. Go back to early April, and you'll find the Pentagon was already struggling to keep its own casualty numbers straight, publishing conflicting figures on its own website within days of each other. One official DCAS page, titled Casualty Summary by Casualty Category, listed 372 troops wounded in action. A separate page on the exact same government website, titled Casualty Summary by Month and Service, listed a noticeably lower number, 357 wounded. Both of those pages had been updated on the exact same day. 2 official government sources, updated simultaneously, reporting 2 different numbers for the exact same statistic, off by roughly 15 troops, which, strangely enough, is almost the exact same size as the mysterious disappearance that would happen weeks later. And it goes even deeper than just the wounded count. The official tally of American deaths has its own troubling gap sitting right in the middle of it. For weeks, the Pentagon's own system listed 13 hostile and non-hostile American deaths during this war and provided the names of those 13 individuals. But missing entirely from that official list was a major named Sorfleet Davies, a signals and communications officer serving with the New York Army National Guard, assigned to the headquarters of the 42nd Infantry Division, who reportedly died of a sudden illness while on duty at Camp Beering in Kuwait back on March 6th. A senior American commander, speaking at a Pentagon press conference, specifically praised what he called the 13 who lost their lives, using the exact same undercounted figure that leaves Major Davies completely unnamed and unrecognized in the Pentagon's own official record. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A soldier died while on active deployment during this war, and the Pentagon's own official casualty tracking system, the one specifically designed to honor and record exactly this kind of sacrifice, simply doesn't include his name. not because his death is disputed, not because there's some question about whether it actually happened, just because the category his death falls into, dying of sudden illness while deployed rather than dying from direct enemy fire, apparently doesn't count toward the number the Pentagon chooses to publicize and repeat out loud at press conferences. This pattern of undercounting isn't actually new either, and understanding its history makes the current situation feel even more deliberate. Reporters who've been tracking this exact issue have pointed out that the system tracks what it calls non-hostile deaths, meaning deaths from accidents or illness, but it specifically does not track non-hostile injuries or illnesses in that same category. That's an enormous, very convenient blind spot. According to a 2024 medical research analysis published in the journal Military Medicine, disease and what's called non-battle injury has historically been the leading cause of casualties among deployed service members throughout the history of warfare, more common even than injuries sustained directly in combat. So by structurally excluding that entire category from public reporting, the Pentagon's own system is set up in a way that almost guarantees a significant undercount of the war's real human toll, even before you get to the question of numbers mysteriously vanishing overnight. Since journalists first began asking hard questions about these undercounts, the slow walking of statistics, and the arcane, inconsistent accounting procedures behind them, both U.S. Central Command and the Office of the Secretary of War have reportedly gone almost entirely silent, refusing to answer follow-up questions or make experts available for interviews on the subject. That kind of institutional silence, stretching across weeks and multiple separate reporting attempts, is itself a meaningful data point. Government agencies generally understand that stonewalling reporters on a sensitive topic tends to generate exactly the kind of suspicious, unflattering coverage that comes from a pattern like this one. The fact that officials appear to have judged ongoing silence as preferable to simply explaining a 15-person discrepancy suggests that whatever the real explanation is, it's apparently not something anyone wanted to say out loud on the record. There's also a specific example buried in this story that shows exactly how these gaps play out in real individual cases. During the war, a fire broke out aboard the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford in mid-March, and more than 200 sailors were reportedly treated for smoke inhalation or lacerations as a result. According to reporting on the Pentagon's own official numbers, those sailors do not appear to be reflected in the official wounded in action count for the Navy, which currently sits at only 63 personnel total. 200 sailors treated for injuries after a fire on an active aircraft carrier, and the official public number for the entire Navy's wounded throughout this whole war barely breaks 60. If that math doesn't add up to you, you're not the only one asking that exact question. And it's worth putting these disputed casualty numbers inside the broader financial scale of this entire war too, because the two things are directly connected. The Pentagon's own comptroller testified before lawmakers back in May that this operation had already cost American taxpayers somewhere around $29 billion. That's a staggering amount of public money, and under normal circumstances, that kind of spending would come with intense scrutiny over exactly what it purchased and exactly what it cost in terms of American lives and injuries. Instead, the same administration that's asked for a record-breaking defense budget on top of that $29 billion has simultaneously struggled, or perhaps refused, to give straight answers about how many of its own troops paid the price for that spending. When an administration wants credit for spending taxpayer money on a war, but goes quiet the moment someone asks exactly how many people got hurt fighting it, that combination alone should raise real questions about where the actual priorities sit. Now let's talk about why this specific kind of undercounting matters so much, beyond just the frustration of imprecise government statistics. Because there's a very real, very human category of injury sitting right at the center of this entire controversy, one that has a disturbing history of getting downplayed by the exact same kind of official reporting systems. The Army, which operates the interceptor missile systems on many of the region's most heavily targeted bases, has suffered more casualties throughout this war than any other branch, with 251 wounded according to official statistics. And only recently has the Army started actively seeking sensors specifically designed to measure something called blast overpressure, the sudden, invisible pressure wave that radiates outward from an explosion, whether that explosion comes from enemy munitions or even from the outgoing blast of America's own defensive weapon systems being fired. That pressure wave can cause real, lasting cognitive impairment and serious effects on brain health, including traumatic brain injuries that don't always show up as an obvious, visible wound. President Trump has, on multiple occasions, publicly dismissed these kinds of brain injuries, referring to them at different points simply as headaches, and describing them as not serious. Meanwhile, U.S. Central Command has claimed that the vast majority of injuries sustained throughout this current war have been, in their own words, minor. If that specific combination of details sounds eerily familiar, it's because almost this exact scenario has already played out once before during Trump's first term in office. Back in January of 2020, after an Iranian missile strike hit al-Assad air base in Iraq, the administration initially told the American public flatly that no Americans were harmed and that the U.S. suffered no casualties whatsoever. That statement turned out to be completely false. Over the following months, the Pentagon was forced to quietly adjust that casualty figure upward at least 5 separate times, eventually admitting that 110 American troops had suffered traumatic brain injuries from that single attack. A later Inspector General report found that the real number might have been even higher, specifically because the Department of Defense couldn't actually confirm that every single affected service member was being properly diagnosed and treated for brain injuries in deployed conditions overseas. So this isn't some brand new pattern nobody's ever seen before. This is, almost move for move, the exact same sequence of denial, minimization, and slow, quiet correction that already happened once, with brain injuries specifically under this exact same administration. Now let's talk about the human cost sitting underneath all of these disputed numbers, because behind every single one of these statistics is a real person, and in many cases, a real family back home trying to understand exactly what happened to someone they love. Military families throughout this war have had to rely almost entirely on official Pentagon statements to understand the scale and severity of what's actually happening to American troops stationed across the region. When those official statements shift without explanation, when wounded totals rise and then mysteriously drop by exactly 15 overnight, when a soldier's name is quietly missing from an official memorial count, that doesn't just create confusing headlines for journalists to argue about. It creates real uncertainty and real pain for the people who are trying to figure out whether their own son, daughter, husband, or wife is accurately represented in the official record of this war at all. Veteran advocacy organizations and family support groups have voiced growing frustration throughout this entire controversy, arguing that inconsistent, unexplained casualty reporting makes it nearly impossible for the people most directly affected by this war to trust that the government is being honest with them about the true scale of what their loved ones have actually been through. Think about what it must feel like to be a parent or a spouse in that exact situation. You already spend every single day worrying about someone you love stationed thousands of miles away in an active war zone. You watch the news, you check official statements, you look for any piece of information that might tell you the real scale of the danger they're actually facing. And then you learn that the exact system meant to track that danger, the one Congress relies on, the one journalists rely on, the one families are implicitly told to trust, has been quietly rearranging its own numbers without a word of public explanation. That's not an abstract policy failure at that point. That's a direct blow to the one thing every military family desperately needs during a war like this one, which is confidence that someone, somewhere, is telling them the truth about what's actually happening. And it's worth remembering that this entire pattern of confusion isn't limited to just this one specific war either. Reporting has connected these current numbers to a broader, ongoing set of attacks against American bases across the Middle East that actually started years earlier, following the outbreak of Israel's war in Gaza back in October of 2023. According to independent analysis, at least 175 American troops were killed or wounded in that earlier wave of regional attacks, including 3 service members who died in a January 2024 strike on a facility known as Tower 22 in Jordan. When you add that earlier toll to the casualties from this current Iran war, independent tallies suggest close to 750 American troops may have been wounded or killed across the broader Middle East since October of 2023, a dramatically higher number than what the Pentagon has been willing to publicly acknowledge for either conflict individually. There's also an uncomfortable diplomatic angle layered on top of all of this, too. Iran's own foreign minister publicly accused the United States of using civilians in nearby Gulf countries as what he called human shields, pointing specifically to reports that American soldiers had been fleeing damaged military bases to hide out in hotels and office buildings instead, and claiming that hotels in the region were beginning to deny bookings to American officers over fears that their presence could put other guests in danger. A former senior American military commander, reviewing these same reports, expressed his own separate concern that housing troops in ordinary hotels and office buildings could effectively convert normal civilian infrastructure into legitimate, seeming military targets in the eyes of the Iranian regime. In fact, according to a State Department cable reviewed by reporters, an Iranian drone strike on a hotel in Bahrain last month reportedly wounded 2 Defense Department employees directly, seemingly confirming exactly the kind of danger both the Iranian foreign minister and the former American commander had been separately warning about. So now you have layers upon layers of the exact same underlying problem. Official casualty numbers that don't match each other on the Pentagon's own website, a dead soldier missing from the official list of the fallen, 200 sailors treated for smoke inhalation who don't appear to be reflected in the Navy's wounded count, a specific category of brain injury with a documented history of being downplayed by this exact same administration. And now, on top of everything else, 15 wounded troops that simply vanished from the official tally overnight, with 2 separate Pentagon spokespeople unable to explain why, and an explanation that, weeks later, still never actually arrived. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge the other side of this story too, because military casualty reporting during any active conflict genuinely is a complicated, messy process, even under the best of circumstances. Injured troops sometimes get reclassified as they recover and return to duty. Numbers sometimes get corrected because of duplicate reporting or delayed paperwork, making its way back from the battlefield to Washington. Not every fluctuation in an official casualty count is automatically evidence of a deliberate cover-up, and it's fair to acknowledge that some of this confusion could stem from legitimate bureaucratic complexity rather than intentional deception. But here's the problem with leaning too heavily on that explanation in this specific case. Legitimate bureaucratic corrections usually come with some kind of accompanying explanation once questions get asked directly. What actually happened here was silence, repeated requests for clarification. Spokespeople who couldn't answer basic questions about their own agency's own published numbers, and weeks passing with zero public accounting for exactly what happened to those 15 missing wounded troops. At some point, unexplained silence, in the face of direct, repeated, specific questions, stops looking like ordinary bureaucratic confusion and starts looking a lot more like a decision not to answer at all. One U.S. government official, speaking anonymously to reporters covering this exact story, used a phrase that's hard to interpret as anything other than a direct accusation, describing the entire pattern of undercounting and unexplained corrections as, in their own words, a casualty cover-up. That's not a term journalists use lightly, and it's not a term a government official uses lightly either, especially when speaking about their own agency's handling of the human cost of an active war. So where does this actually leave us? A war that officially claims 13 American deaths, while independent tracking suggests the real number may be closer to 15. A wounded count that has bounced between roughly 350 and over 500, depending on which specific government source or independent tally you happen to be looking at on any given day. A soldier whose name still doesn't appear on the Pentagon's own official list of the fallen from this war. And 15 wounded troops who disappeared from an official public record overnight, with an explanation that, as of everything we currently know, still has never actually been given. Every single number in that list represents a real person, and in most cases, a real family somewhere, trying to understand exactly what happened to someone they loved during this war. When those numbers keep shifting without explanation, when names go missing from official records, when spokespeople repeatedly can't answer basic questions about their own published statistics, that's not just a frustrating story for journalists trying to track down accurate figures. It's a genuine breach of trust with the exact families who arguably have the most right to know precisely what happened to the people they sent overseas. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this kind of casualty confusion is mostly the result of the Pentagon's genuinely messy, outdated reporting systems struggling to keep up with a fast-moving war? Or do you think this looks a lot more like a deliberate effort to keep the true human cost of this conflict quieter than it actually is?